memory recalls, is that to do with intellect, would you say, or intelligence, or would you just say it was, or what would you say it was? Because you do get some people that have much better, have excellent memory recall, and long and short term, others don't.
So I think my answer to that question would be that there is no given explanation for it, and the simplest one I would have, which I believe probably is closest to truth, would be use it or lose it. And therefore, if, for example, you keep working on those sort of memory processes, and if, for example, you are constantly using those systems, you're going to improve it in the same way as an athlete will improve their performance by constant practice. I mean, it's intuitive for me that that's the way that it would work. And basically, there is now a lot of evidence to suggest that when you have these mind games, it can actually improve how a person can perform. I find this very... Can people hear me without this? Yeah? Can I? It sort of it's better with it. Yeah. Oh, okay, fine, good. You win.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. With bipolar disorder, do you think that that could be triggered by something that happened early in life, perhaps, and then the person blocked it off in their memory, and then something triggers that, and then that may bring about an episode, and then they have, you know, a series of episodes after that. Do you think that, and would something like hypnosis help to maybe find out what was the thing that triggered that initially?
Okay. So now I get personal. I really don't believe in psychoanalysis. Okay? There is no empirical basis for it. So therefore, as a scientist, I actually don't follow that line of thought. It may be that maybe the ideas are correct. There is no evidence that is hard and fast, the sort of evidence that's demanded of me for the sort of experiments that I do. That said, now I could talk about bipolar illness. For me, bipolar illness is really quite it's quite an interesting, well, all of these diseases are quite fascinating, if very devastating. Bipolar depression, in which you have swings of mood, you can go up and then for a period of time, and that elevated mood can be really devastating for the individuals around that person. You can come home and find your house has been sold. A very expansive mood. Into then periods in which they're in the depths of depression. And the only way I can understand that is as they've described it to me, people in depression, intense mental pain. I can't even begin to imagine what that feels like or what it's like. And a total inability to experience pleasure. If you just think about that for a short time, it's horrific. Now, when you talk about something like bipolar depression, it begins to emerge in late adolescence. Not unlike schizophrenia, it emerges in late adolescence. And this, as a neurobiologist, fascinates me. Because when you extend that idea, what you find is that all brain diseases emerge in a developmental manner. So autism will emerge in the first year to 3 years. Bipolar depression in adolescence. Schizophrenia in adolescence. Familial Alzheimer's disease around the 50s. Sporadic Alzheimer's disease, mid-60s, 70s. Parkinson's disease, 60. They always appear at the same time. And for me, it's some sort of suggestion that the impact of the environment can trigger these in a susceptible individual. So an individual could be made susceptible by having some hereditary factors that might predispose them to that condition. But it will be a mixture of nature and nurture, where the environment will actually impact and cause this effect to occur at a certain time in development. And I'm talking development womb to tomb. So you can argue that stress, for example, can precipitate these conditions, especially in a susceptible individual. Be that individual susceptible because they have a genetic makeup or that they have an environmental situation. But they precipitate these conditions. And it's, for me, uniform across mental disease. So I'm sorry that I can't go down the road that you started your question with, but I hope I've in part answered it from at least my point of view.
Just on the same subject loosely, you mentioned specifically unipolar depression and its association with memory deficit. I was just wondering if that still applied to bipolar depression. And I would like you to elaborate, if you could, on the link between memory and depression, because I could understand what you're saying to a certain extent about kind of sort of neurons maybe not being quite as branched, or kind of not as plastic, but just if you could relate that specifically to memory.
I thought I tried to escape from that question, but I'll go back to it earlier in that it's very newly, no, don't apologize, it's very newly emerging area. Okay, so you're talking about the last 5 to 10 years that this idea is beginning to emerge. But when you think about something like, for example, unipolar depression, and I'm sure many of us have met unfortunates with this dreadful condition, because it's very common. I mean, it's up to 5% of a population will have it. And really, you're looking in many ways in a disordered thinking mechanism. I mean, the individual is inconsolable. I mean, you just cannot have that individual talked out of it. You can't get them to pull up their socks. It's an impossibility. So there's some sort of cognitive upset there. And when you look then at the statistics of suicide in such populations, these are really substantial. And that is an ultimate inward act of aggression. And it's a very damaging act. So somehow cognition is upset. So now to go to the other point that you were talking about, which is the idea that you might have an upset in plasticity and or the connectivity pattern. So let's now think back to the point I made in the last question, which related to the idea that you've got developmental emergence of disease. Supposing that you have a situation where that plasticity is not up to scratch, can't actually pull it together, right? And we're looking at adolescence. The brain is still forming itself. It's actually still eliminating synapses in the final patterning of what will make every individual unique. So if you had a situation where there was a weakness in how you might hold those synapses together, right, then it could emerge, and it could emerge. I would explain why it emerges at that point. So then what I was talking about was the idea that drugs might actually impact on that, and standard antidepressants, which take a long time to work, are now known to elevate growth factors in the brain that are necessary to get that blossoming of connections, to get that connectivity pattern put into place. And that, of course, takes time. And another thing that you can see in those conditions is that you have new neurons being born. There are special areas in the brain where new neurons can be born. And they're, of course, incredibly dynamic and incredibly plastic, which could integrate into the system and therefore have a repairing effect. So what I would envisage in these conditions is, because of the developmental emergence, because of the notion of cognition, and because of the ideas of plasticity, that these actually draw together to form the individual. And if there's a weakness in those, they may not come together in the way that you hope that they might. And when you look at the sort of cognitive deficits that might be associated with, for example, schizophrenia or unipolar depression, the prodromal, in other words, the cognitive upsets that you see before the condition manifests itself. They're very different. So there's different aspects of cognition involved. Now, I can't be as precise in respect of your question on depression, which particular forms of cognition are upset.
Yeah, a question on false memory. Do we know how it appears and how it's formed?
Oh, I think that's fascinating. Yeah, I would use another term, memory distortion. In other words, how you actually formulate that particular memory and how you recall it. And there are many, many well-established studies in the area that you describe, false memory or distorted memory. And basically that would be the individual forming that memory, resculpting that memory, putting a different complexure on that memory, and therefore having that memory in their own terms of reference, which is completely different to another's term of reference.
How important do you think our linguistic ability is in differentiating the way human memory works from memory in other animals?
I don't. Yeah, this is an area I'm not really good on, but it's a very, very important area because basically the one thing that distinguishes us from the non-primate animals is that we have this very remarkably developed frontal part of the brain. And it's best developed in the human condition as compared to non-human primates. I don't think that it is simply a linguistic aspect. I think there's more to it than just simply linguistic ability. But it is very much considered that the formation of this area of the brain was essential in our forms of communication. And certainly damage to that area has very serious impact on how you communicate between individuals and how you establish that social interaction. So is your question?
I was more thinking about how, well, I know myself, if I'm trying to remember something, I will remember things in word form. Whereas if you don't have language, you can't store memory in that way.
Well, I suppose you're now into symbols. The word will be the symbol. So many species will operate with symbols, and they're very well established. I mean, if I'm just thinking about the sort of mating patterns between birds, I mean, very well established symbols of how they can work. So it may be a mechanism that you employ, but the whole communication, which is part language, is through the formation of this big prefrontal area which characterizes us.
I was just thinking earlier on, you mentioned PTSD and that it was kind of a facet of the memory mechanism. And if you don't think much of psychoanalysis, is there a good strategy to, for people with chronic PTSD, let's say, to reverse it? What would you see?
Okay. It's not that I don't think much of psychoanalysis. I don't see that has an empirical basis, and as a scientist I can't accept it. It may be great and it may work, but there's no empirical basis for it, and I suppose I have to be quite dogmatic about that because of where my philosophy comes from. Go to PT, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is really, really quite interesting because, and also the point you make about can you reverse it. In post-traumatic stress disorder, the current wisdom is that if you have such an emotionally searing memory, it is crucially important that that memory is embedded with absolute accuracy. So therefore, the idea of tinkering with it, relating it to other memories, to enhance it into the sort of memory you might want, for example, like false memories. In that situation, that is not permitted. The actual memory is cast really, really very tightly. Now, the idea of reversing it is something that has been talked about. But really, it centers on an unusual concept. And that concept is that, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with this concept, but there is a concept there that when you reactivate a memory, it becomes labile. And therefore, you can sculpt it further and put it back, so to speak. So the idea in post-traumatic stress disorder might be that somehow you can bring that into a labile form, re-exposing the individual, and at the same time intervene with certain drugs like beta blockers, for example, have been suggested as having a potential in trying to break open that linkage. You have the same type of problem when you're dealing with something like drug addiction. Those memories are so tightly put into place that to break them open, you really have to have quite imaginative strategies, which I would say are not readily available. The moment, all you can do is try and stop the drug use, try and deal with the symptoms that arise because you're stopping the drug use, but to actually prevent relapse is a true challenge. And the most effective way of preventing relapse is to get the individual out of a situation where they are familiar with the drug use. So therefore, if somebody is in an addicted state and you can dry them out, so to speak, if you can shift them out to, emigrate or that would be an ideal time to actually change that pattern. So there is an extension then to your question about post-traumatic stress disorder using the same type of mechanism. And a number of people advocate certain drugs in that period.
Any questions? Following you, what you're saying, it means that there are drugs that could make you forget conscious. At the same time, there are drugs that could make you remember better.
There are drugs that can make you forget, indeed. But those drugs are really only active when the memory is active. So you can have drugs that will render you completely amnesic. For example, the drugs that you might use or that might be used upon you for dental treatment, for example, they at their highest concentration when you're having a dental procedure done, they will render you amnesic of what has happened. Okay? So therefore, and there are other drugs that if, for example, you had this particular drug, you won't be able to learn a task. It'll erase it, right? So therefore, think about the idea where if you take memory and you bring it back into a labile state, and now you can erase it because you're moving in with a drug that can do that.
What drugs, for instance?
Well, for example, scopolamine, for example, beta blockers can be used to elicit those effects. But it's very experimental, and I don't think that there is a standard, clinical practice that is available for that. I should point out I'm not a clinician.
Any other questions there? Right down the bottom.
I actually have a question. Do you see a relationship between memory and instincts? Basically, a relationship between memory of us as individuals and memory of us as a species?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Sorry.
Memory between us and?
Sorry? Do you see a relationship
as instinct.
And for example,
memory and instinct.
autistic individuals, and memory maybe, do you believe that there's sort of a memory that belongs to a species? For example, humans.
Oh, okay. Do I believe in cultural memory? Is that it?
Cultural memory, but you know, like species, it's kind of embedded in people to be afraid of heights.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes, I do. So there is. I suppose what you am I right in thinking that you're circling on the idea of when a fledgling is pushed out of the nest, it automatically flies? Yeah. So yes, I do believe in that. I do believe that there are natural autonomic responses that, for example, kickstart the organism, so to speak, and that these are in actual fact nurtured in the womb, and that you can have very dramatic effects occurring when a fetus can be in the womb, which will in turn have impact on that the development of that fetus. Okay, so there are innate responses, reflexes, which are naturally programmed and naturally developed. But you then have a situation where the child emerges, and that child has got vast number of connections, far, far more than they could ever require. And what happens then is that there is a period in which they are trimmed back. And that trimming gets the individuality, and it gets the specialities that will last with that individual throughout life. So the postnatal period is crucial. Now the prenatal period is incredibly sensitive because a lot is happening in the developing of that individual. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that nerve cells are going to start falling apart, but it can change the patterning. It can change the timing of the patterning. And that happens a lot, or is believed to happen a lot, with a lot of pollutants that we find in our environment. For example, dioxins, for example, these persisting chemicals that you get subtle change through prenatal and through lactation, early postnatal period. Does that answer your question?
Ask, you know, if a very young child, say a baby up to the age of a year or 2 years, has been exposed to many different languages and cultures, does that in any way have an impact on them? Obviously they can't recall that, but does it have any impact on them, say, as opposed to somebody who hasn't been exposed at that age to, does it have any effect in the long term?
I suppose that goes back to the question of, good people are good at recall and poor at recall. And I think that, yes, there would be that type of facility developed. And it's not something that I'm completely familiar with, but I do seem to recall that in an adult, if they are learning a new language, it is almost, if I recall correctly, it's in a completely different area to the language that they might use, their current language. It's almost as if they force open another area. Now, how that might apply to the point that you make, which would be a developmental aspect, exposure to these different cultures, and the facility to change language, presumably would sculpt, form, and tune a system that would respond to it.
I remember listening to a program on memory where distinction was made between the kind of memory that you have when you know that you're in your own house or that you're not in your own house, and another type of memory which you can actually recall the situation, the smell, the visual experiences. Are these really two different types of memory? Do they reside in different parts of the brain, and do they develop in a child differently?
Okay. I can't answer the latter part, but I think what we're talking about are the two classical forms of memory. There is declarative memory, where you declare what you know, and that would be what most people, I believe, associate with memory, recall. But there is another form of memory which is called non-declarative. And in non-declarative memory, really what is happening there is individuals are juggling information that they are perceiving with information that they have stored. And I've referred to this earlier, where salience of information is managed. So you've got two forms of memory, declarative and non-declarative. They're the major forms. Declarative memory is associated with one brain region, it's known as the hippocampus, or more correctly, the entirety of the temporal lobe. And the other is the non-declarative form, which is associated with the prefrontal areas. And they're the two systems that are the major divisions of memory. They can be subdivided, but again, you're going into more tedium at that point. These are the two major classifications.
You spoke there about the postnatal development and the cutting back of the development of
Connections, yeah.
Connections. How does that develop along a kind of a timeline? Like, is it, I suppose, and is it a parallel development of personality and the actual cutting back that goes on throughout life?
The cutting back is really carried out in the first, I would say, okay, so you're born with complement of connections. You've got far too many, and the cutting back will occur around 3 to 5 years. That's when the major cutting begins to start. But also, you have a slow attenuation of that elimination up to point of adolescence. That's why, for me, the idea that you get developmental emergence in neuropsychiatric diseases is really of great interest, because it's at that period where you're getting that modeling, that sculpting of the circuits that are going to form the individual.
Any more questions there?
I know you went the pharmacology of various substances. It's difficult to give kind of succinct answer, but just on the action of alcohol actually on memory, and like everybody's had the experience of not remembering something the next day. Is that they initially the memories don't get laid down at the time, or is it that they're subsequently forgotten by some other action?
I'm smiling, it's just frank amnesia. So, sorry, not to be flippant at all. Basically, with alcohol, so it's a very, all drugs, actually, should preface this by saying all drugs that affect the mind are very curious, in the sense that it depends on your state of mind in taking the drug as to how that drug is going to work. And the classic example is the one you pick, alcohol. So, if you've had a tremendous success, you might want to go out and celebrate, and you might go with your friends, and you have lots of beers, and the mood gets greater and greater and greater until you fall over. And then you've got the amnesia kicking in. Equally, you can have a dreadful time, you're really depressed, you decide you're going to have a drink to cheer you up, but it will have exactly the opposite effect. And you get worse and worse and worse until you fall over. And it is just simple, straightforward anesthetic action. You just keep loading up the dose. And what happens is that so in the brain you've got two systems. You've got a system that keeps you awake and a system that keeps you asleep. Okay? And basically they're in balance. And with alcohol, what happens is that the sleep system slowly actually becomes more quickly affected. And therefore you get excitement and you get excessive excitation, but inhibitory control is lost. So you start telling things that maybe you wouldn't normally tell, right? And then as the dose increases, that begins to fall apart, and then you're gone. And basically, none of the information is stored. It's like the conversation we had about drugs that can cause amnesia. Alcohol is excellent at it. And it's just frank amnesia that you've got.
Sorry, I was just going to ask one controversial question, but like, is there any difference between gender on like how we recall memories, or where we store, or even just like, I don't know, just any difference?
Absolutely, absolutely. Take parking. In actual fact, in looking, no, but in actual fact, I've picked that purposefully because spatial ability in male versus female is very different. And the other fascinating thing, for me at least, is spatial ability changes in a female with birth. In other words, after birth, you find this massive increase in spatial ability or capability. You know, it's attributed to, for example, nesting or whatever, I don't know. But you do find remarkable differences in memory processing between males and females. And why wouldn't you? I mean, it's not, at least for me, a surprise.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just on alcohol amnesia. I'm just wondering if there's some mechanism by where there's like cumulative effect of alcohol use, where your brain is kind of primed to become more susceptible to the whole alcohol amnesia thing over time. Like what's actually going on?
Yeah. So if, okay, so many drugs can be abused, okay, and they all have different modes of action. So you really need to look at what's the immediate effect and the long-term effect. And I think you're circling on the long-term effects. So in the immediate effect, by and large, what you see is that the excitability of nerve cells and their incipient communication is directly affected. But if you start loading it in again and again and again, what happens is the change now switches. Well, another change becomes apparent. And that change relates to the nucleus, where you've got your DNA. And normally the nucleus is there very happily producing the proteins that keep your cell functioning properly. But once you have a persistence of a drug effect, what can happen is the signals that go to the nucleus change the nature of the proteins that are being made. And you get a fundamentally different cell. And therefore, that cell now responds differently. It can manage much more alcohol. It's attuned to alcohol. But if you remove the alcohol, then it begins to crave, because what makes it function is dependent on that drug, be it alcohol, be it cocaine. And you therefore get a change, not unlike the ones we've discussed in reference to depression, where you're seeing changes in, there are proposed changes in the nature of the connectivity pattern and the possibility that it might have been repaired. Does that?
I guess there was a question was specifically the alcohol amnesia, just that would become more exacerbated over time. So just wondering if there's specific atrophy in neural areas that would be tied to memory, or if it's just a general state of just repetition of experience.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to make a cop-out first. Because when you're dealing with post-mortem tissue from alcoholics, it's a nightmare. Because you don't know if the changes are arising from the alcohol or the alcoholic banging their head off the ground. Because they're doing that all of the time. They're having awful falls, right? And in that situation, those studies are really hard to interpret. However, if you take our friend the rat, and that animal is available, or it has alcohol available to it, yes, you can see atrophy occurring in certain brain areas, but in other brain areas you can see growth. And those other brain areas are those which are the pleasure zones of the brain. They're really loving it, and they're growing, and they're becoming much more adapted. And you see it with cocaine, and you see it with heroin. Huge blossoming, you know. And what you're having is a system now that's attuned to surviving with this pleasure level, and it has all of its connections to enjoy it.
Let's take one more question. Did you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask you talked quite a bit about the start off with vast number of neural connections, and that you form your memories and your personality by removing connections, sculpting, cutting bits out. But and you have mentioned that repetition makes some memories strong. But what I think, as I listened, you haven't said very much about is making new connections. Because I thought that in a lot of laying down memory and developing new experiences, you actually were making new connections, and that these connections initially might be fairly labile and able to fall apart again, but that the more the experience repeated, the stronger they became and the less likely to fall apart, so that a memory, whether it be of a tune or whether it be of the fine skills to do a particular action, improved.
You're absolutely correct in all aspects. What might have caused the confusion is that the conversation suddenly directed into development. Exactly as you have suspected, the view of the continuing plasticity that can exist is true. Now, I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but the view that I hold and others hold is that as you're processing information, you get a transience in the number of connections. So for a short period of time, you get a blossoming of connections. And that allows almost a replay of what has happened in development. You can select and eliminate. And when you get down to the baseline, you've now got an altered connectivity pattern. That actually, the ability to do that decreases with aging. But systems we know necessary for it in the human are there in the 80th or in the 8th decade. We know they still exist. So yes, it's almost a replay of the developmental sculpting, as you call it.
Okay. Oh, very, very quick. Then we're back. Go first. Yeah, yeah.
Just to go back quickly with the gender difference, you were talking about the mothers when they get when they have a baby, they have better memory for nesting or something. But you heard about the mom's brain apparently where they keep forgetting things.
The what?
They call it mom's brain. Apparently there's also a
What?
Mum's brain.
Mum's brain.
yeah, mother's brain. When I don't know, but apparently there's a symptom that they keep forgetting things after having babies. Have you heard of that?
Actually, when they're pregnant.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually don't know that, but that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean,
Have you heard women say that they can't recall words, they can't speak
yeah, it's kind of
as fluently
familiar.
as they used
Yeah.
to speak, and there's a theory that would be because the baby, when they're pregnant, maybe, yeah, and it's because the baby is building his connections, maybe it takes some of the nutrients from the mother, I don't know, and then I don't know
Well, I mean, they have to take experience in utero from the mother, but I don't see how that might link through what the mother, I mean, I'm trivializing it, I'm not trivializing the issue, but I mean, how the mother might be thinking might actually transmit to the fetus, other than if that is stressful, then it will translate very easily. But, you know, the fact that the mother's a little forgetful, I can't see how that might translate. Now, you said something, Veronica? Lack of sleep. Oh, yes, and the embedding. Oh, sorry, that's an awful pun. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
one last.
One last very
School night.
I was just wondering about across the water, David Nutt.
Oh, yeah.
Thoughts on the famous Government Advisory Committee, and just what your thoughts are.
Yeah. I mean, I know David well, and yes, I can see how he got into trouble. But he's right, as far as I'm concerned. He's absolutely right. But so is the, what was the guy's name, the politician?
Johnson.
Was it Johnson? I think, yes. I mean, there are political decisions and there are pharmacological decisions. And as far as I'm concerned, Nutt's view is correct. There are things out there that are far worse than cannabis, like alcohol, like nicotine, okay? Much more effective. But the other point is that when you start talking about drugs and you start talking about culture, that's a totally different thing. And what is acceptable within a culture, that is the domain of the politician. They are responding to what the individuals in that community want. And therefore, yes, I believe that both parties are right. But Nutt is absolutely right. And so is the politician, because he's been told, no, you're not removing our Friday night glass of wine, or indeed Tuesday night pint of Guinness.
But did he cross the route when he...
Pardon?
Did he kind of go a step too far when he suggested, based on empirical evidence, to downgrade MDMA? Was that something that was just too unpalatable?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he had to go.
Yeah. Yeah. This goes into the most fantastic debates of, I suppose you would describe as nanny states. But I don't know if we want to go there at this stage. Mills and what is it, Bentham? Oh yeah.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. And you've been talking for a long time. God bless you. There are a lot of questions. Thank you so much for that. You're very,
Pleasure,
very good.
Julie.
Just a little quick applause as well.
Oh.
Really done well.
Thank you very much. How lovely.
Thank
My goodness.
you. And just to say as well, Ciaran was very, very good. I contacted him just not even 2 weeks ago when he agreed to do it with such short notice. Really, really appreciate it as well. It was very, very interesting. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
I really do appreciate it.
Thank you all for the
No
questions.
problem.